The brutal war in Ukraine seems to know no bounds, leaving death and destruction in its wake, the world's largest refugee crisis, and the international community still struggling with exactly what to do. And here at home, everything from a long-awaited papal apology to the slap heard around the world. And of course, new political coalitions and surprising political partnerships. So where else would we go in this time of change and flux and drama? Dr. Darrell, CEO of IPSOS Public Affairs, an international polling firm who's out there taking our pulse every single day of the week. So I don't know, Darrell, let's start with Ukraine. What are Canadians thinking?
Well, Canadians and most of the world that we would recognize as being our allies are looking at what's happening in Ukraine with a large level of disgust. I mean, they're not impressed by what's coming out of there. And as a result, they're looking at strong support, public opinion, strong support for anything that has to do with sanctions, supplying military material to the Ukrainian government to help them defend themselves. And there's absolute strong support for that. Anything short of actually engaging in any sort of military conflict in that area. And that's when Canadian public opinion, but also American public opinion and public opinion in most other countries, pulls up short. So anything except going in and having that kind of...
Why is that?
They're very afraid, I would say, of any sort of confrontation with Russia that could bring the threat of nuclear war. So Putin's willingness to raise that as a topic early on was heard by citizens of Canada and citizens of our ally countries. And while we're very sympathetic with what the Ukrainian population is going through, including opening up our doors to accept Ukrainian refugees, which has very high levels of support, the idea of actually getting into an armed conflict in which we would risk the potential for nuclear war draws us up short.
So put that in the context of Canadian policy, because we know we have left our northern flank sadly so exposed. I mean, we've got nothing up there but a snowbank for all intents and purposes. And then we've seen kind of a change on the part of the government who said no, never to F-35s, who are now opening up that discussion again.
Yeah, and in fact, you didn't hear any pushback. There was no great outrage when the announcement was made earlier or last week about the F-35s. I think if absent the war that we're going through right now, particularly given the financial difficulties Canada is in right as a result of the pandemic, but also rapidly increasing inflation, probably there would be a lot of very loud voices, including voices from the NDP. That would be strongly objecting to this, but there was nary a whisper for many opponents, other than to observe that this was a complete about face by the Liberal government. But nobody cares at the moment because the world, what's happening in Canada right now, is not being seen through a partisan lens. So it's not an electoral situation. It's not a political circumstance right now. So people are looking at the best decisions given what the circumstances are. And the Ukrainian war has made military procurement a more interesting, actually a more relevant option for Canadians. Although when we go out and we ask people on surveys about what they think their priorities should be in budgets, defense spending is not moved up to the top of the list by any stretch of the imagination.
But there is that conversation again, as there always is in Canada. I don't know if people, if it really resonates, but we have never met our 2% of GDP commitment to NATO. They are begging for it, both our NATO allies and, of course, the Ukrainians. The NDP, as part of this new coalition now with the government, has said no to that. Was that maybe part of the trade-off with F-35s or a little bit more procurement?
I don't know that anybody, the public opinion has got into it that far, but I just think it's really noteworthy that the usual outrage that we would hear about us around a substantial military procurement or a government completely reversing itself on an issue would have received a lot harder pushback than we saw last week. And I think in terms of public opinion, people are more aware that we need to be doing things for the military. Things like saying, for example, we're going to get up to 2% of our GDP for military investment. Nobody knows what that means, what the trade-offs are that are related to that. So if we actually do have a debate about 2%, outside of the more immediate context of what's going on in Ukraine, I don't expect that Canadian public opinion will have changed that radically. We'll see. It all comes down to the trade-offs that'll be required.
Yeah. So here we are heading toward a budget. And there is the tension there, no question. And this tends to be a more partisan question between more spending, continued borrowing, and maybe putting the brakes on. Again, the Prime Minister announcing a dental care program, signing the deal with Ontario that concludes a really significant daycare, childcare program for the entire country. And nobody's looking at price tags on that. They're looking at, oh, that's a good idea, or not, but not really the financial side.
You and I are both old enough to have lived through the last time that we went through this. Doesn't this feel like the 1970s to you?
Yep.
Where, Justin Trudeau's father did exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing in an NDP coalition, and ended up electing Brian Mulroney with the biggest majority in modern Canadian history. So it's a really interesting situation. My sense is that public opinion, at some point, the pendulum will swing back on spending. And the reason for that is there is a strong enough coalition in public opinion that's mindful of things like deficits and taxes and spending, that at some point there will be a move back against that, because we are at some point going to have to pay the price for this. I don't think anybody with any sense in their head actually thinks that modern monetary theory, in which you can just print money, is deficits don't matter. You can't spend an entire generation of 2 generations of history telling people that they do, for all of a sudden for them to believe that they don't. The way I would describe it, Senator, is that Canadians look at what we're going through with the pandemic, and maybe even a bit of what we're going through with this war at the moment, as a break the glass, pull the alarm. We need to do things to deal with this immediate problem, and not worry about that the fiscal effects that much in the short term. But that's not an endorsement of, this should be our approach to everything that we're confronted with. At some point, we're going to see the pendulum swing back on this, because Canadians are not saying to governments, it's carte blanche, spend on whatever you think is a good idea. What they are saying is, in this emergency circumstance, I think that we need to do something to deal with these problems, but everything is not an emergency, and everything doesn't deserve exactly the same level of treatment. So that's one thing. And then the second part of this will be moving over to the question of actual delivery. Okay, so we announced a new childcare program. What's that actually mean? And how long is it going to actually set up an infrastructure to deliver all of this?
$10 a day.
By the way, at a time when Canada is experiencing its lowest birth rate in history.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and there's also issues, and we've talked about this before in other contexts, but, in small towns and rural areas, we don't have daycares. We have, the neighbor, and the program kind of has to capture that at some point.
Yeah, and that's where, the devil will be in the details. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of big rhetoric around this. There's a lot of big money being presented around this, but the actual delivery tends to be something that this government struggles with. Actually, delivering something that, 3 years after it was announced, people say, my life is better as a result of this, is what was done. They have been able to do it on things like changing some of the family tax load, because that's a relatively easy thing to do. You don't have to deliver a program. All you have to do is change the way taxes are calculated and checks are delivered. That's something different. They have been able to change it on things like the carbon tax, for example. Okay, well, that's a big decision. It's implemented around the country in a relatively easy way. But actually creating daycare spaces with qualified daycare professionals, making those spaces available to people in a way that will affect their day-to-day lives. That's a different challenge, and that's where this government has struggled on, delivering programs that made actual differences outside of the tax code and things of that nature.
Well, and it hits different places. I mean, the most recent hike in the carbon tax, I mean, that has a much greater impact on a farmer that is just about to head out into the field than it does to somebody driving an EV in Toronto.
Well, the thing about EVs in Canada right now, they still remain status symbols. They're not really a practical solution for most people who live in the most important part of the country relative to deciding election campaigns.
Elections, yes.
And that's people who live in the suburbs. So those people who are of our major cities, and those are the people who are about to experience going back to work. They remember what it was to fill their car up back in February of 2020. Mm-hmm. Let's take a look at what it's going to be in 2022 and what it's going to be in April, in May, when people do start going back to work. Now, granted, we're going to have some hybrid models. There's different things that the workplace is going to mean, but people who weren't going back to the office at the same level that they were, back to their workplace the way that they were previously, now are going to be going back. And they have very familiar marker points. What I spent back in February 2020 and what I'm spending today. And I just filled up my car the other day, and it was quite a significant difference. Yeah. And will again be quite a significant difference as a result of the tax that was brought in this week. So I'm wondering what the sticker shock and the reality will be. There's some people who will attack the government as doing this at the wrong time and adding to what is the single biggest issue for Canadians at this moment, which is dealing with the cost of living. In fact, it's as the pandemic has come down, cost of living has replaced it. So what was happening in the last time we went through this was that we had a whole series of important issues that got blocked out, and they were basically make the world a better place type issues. Climate change, everything related to identity and tolerance and equity and all that kind of stuff was really prominent. And those issues got pushed out by the pandemic. But last summer, they started to make their way back up as the pandemic came down. This time around, it's not that at all. This time around, it's all of these very difficult and very emotional personal issues related to my economic survivability that have moved up and starting to replace the pandemic. So there's one group of people who will look at it through that lens when they start going back to work. And there's another group, and would be the people who are making these policies, who will say, well, this is a really good signal to the public about why they should be abandoning their, gas-powered cars, and they should be moving over to electric vehicles. And it will achieve the goal that we need to achieve, because that's basically what a carbon tax and other increases of costs of energy are supposed to do. They're supposed to make us make wiser decisions about how we use energy. I'm undecided as to which side of that will win. I have a feeling that the pushback on the people who are dealing with the costs and availability and practicality of these issues will be stronger than the people who are on the Build Back Better Green Revolution side are anticipating.
Because some of your numbers, your recent numbers on that you've done for the industry, looking at whether people still love or hate the oil and gas sector and still believe whether, that it's going to be there. You've got a lot of people in this time, but again, I'll ask, is it related to the Ukraine mindset at this point? And then those that are saying, holding the line on the move to green, that was a relatively low number. So is that also low because of Ukraine?
Canadians, it's not so much Ukraine as much as it is the actual experience of going and opening up an envelope from your local power provider and seeing what the cost is, and going to the gas pump and seeing what the cost is. Going to buy an airline ticket and realizing how expensive that is because of the cost of fuel. So it's not an intellectual conversation. It's an actual personal conversation. Right. And yes, what's happening in Ukraine can be one of the things that people point to, but they can't protest the Russian government.
Right.
They can vote Canadian government out. I mean, they can reflect it in that way. And as far as the people who are on the green side of this, none of this means that Canadians don't think that climate change is real. None of it means that Canadians don't think that we should be doing something about climate change. None of it reflects a change in their view about what our future should be. But in this time that we find ourselves in, the priority has moved away from the top of the hierarchy, where it's about making the world a better place, down to a lower level in the priorities, the hierarchy of needs, where it's more about survival. And that's where we are.
Yeah.
This is my life.
Those are the issues, because we're seeing inflation at moving toward record levels. It's already much higher in the US. Interest rates going up. Cost of food is already up because of supply chain issues and inflation. Like, there's a whole lot of economic factors coming into play at once. So what you're saying here is the response to that will be, this is now really hitting me, put the brakes on a little bit.
It's dreams mugged by reality. That's basically what's happening right now. And what is really an interesting thing that is, I'll present it as a hypothesis rather than as a thing that's actually happening, but something that, as I look at these data in terms of public opinion accumulate over time, is that I'm really wondering what all of this says about the achievement of striving middle class people. And where it really comes down hard is on the issue of housing. And when we typically have a conversation about housing, it's way down the list in terms of issues. It's, typically gets what's most important issue facing the country today. Housing will be like 2, 3, 4, 5%. And if we went out and we probed on that, what people would be talking about is homelessness, or they would be talking about access to low-income housing in communities. So dealing with
kids buy a house.
No.
They're not. Okay.
They were talking about that. What's happened is the middle class is piling in on this issue now. And it's about, am I ever going to be able, can my kids buy a house? But am I ever able, the kids themselves saying, am I ever going to be able to achieve what I thought I was going to achieve in my life after I invested in this big education, saved all this money, did all of these things that I was supposed to do. And now you're telling me I have to live 3 hours outside of where I work.
Right.
And I can't even buy into a house in the neighborhood that I grew up in anymore. And so what's happening is that is becoming a dominant issue in Canada. So for the first time that I've seen in the time that I've been doing this, we've had housing top our polling as the most important issue facing the country.
That is really interesting.
And to me, that's not about just the practical aspects of the number of houses and the rest of it. Yes, that might be the solution.
Right.
It's really about, what does it say about our aspirations and our dreams?
Because it's not an interest rate question, is what you're saying. It's the dream. Yeah.
And so what happens when you burst that bubble? And that's where it gets really interesting. And so what we're seeing is the bubbling up of this general level of frustration among the younger generation. And it's an unfocused type of frustration, but it has a number of things that are caught up in it. People who are worried about climate change, that we're not making any progress on it. People who, for example, the most interesting piece of data I've seen, other than housing topping the list as the most important issue, is that the people who supported the Black Lives Matter movement a year ago are the same people who supported the truckers.
Wow.
So what's that? Younger, more precarious people. Not a partisan issue for them. What do they identify with? Frustration.
Yeah.
I'm frustrated.
So there was a misread on what that was about by the political forces and coming in with the hammer of the Emergencies Act.
Well, the Laurentian elite tends to have their own way of looking at the country, which is uniquely theirs. In the rest of the country, people aren't thinking that way. It was interesting to see who the people were who were most supportive of going in and taking on the truckers and lowering the hammer. It was people who were concerned about law and order, who were older people.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't younger people to the same extent. It was older people. And by the way, older people who were more upset about what was going on with Black Lives Matter. So you see younger people suggesting, when you look at these data, that maybe they see more emphatic ways of stating their displeasure, demonstrating their displeasure, other than just voting in election campaigns. So there's all I'm saying is something's going on here.
Yeah.
When you combine all of this, that is different from what it was 2 years ago.
I tend to look at that, obviously, as you know, through the free speech issue, that a lot of the groups that said, okay, I may not have loved the truckers, but we have a right to protest. And what is it going to mean the next time there's an Indigenous protest or a women's protest or a Black Lives Matter protest? Are they only going to use the hammer on truckers, not causes they are more sympathetic to?
Yeah, and that's where the charges of being hypocritical or overreacting or underreacting. Then we get in. Once you open up that Pandora's box, then you start getting into these other things. But did Canadians want to see the Parliament Hill shut down forever, and what was going on in Ottawa going on forever? No, even the people who supported them didn't think that this was a great thing.
Correct.
What resonated was the frustration.
Yeah.
I understand why. I don't agree with what they're doing, but I understand why. For 46% of the population.
That's a significant number.
It's about half.
Wow. Okay, I want to touch on a couple of other issues because you mentioned it just in passing, and a couple of things. So this week in the Senate, we once again, just because of the timing and we don't have the proper resources and governments are late, we passed the spending estimates with no idea what the government is really going to spend, the total amounts, or what they're spending it on. That's very frustrating for those of us here. Is there going to be any resonance in that? I mean, you've touched on people are knowing that the spending can't go on forever. And that's tied very much into the whole question of, is anybody ever going back to work? Is COVID really over? Because those two things keep clashing.
Yeah, and that's the question is, at what point are we not breaking the glass and pulling the fire alarm? I mean, so are we in a period in which we're not doing that anymore? Or, have we replaced it with another set of emergencies? But one of the things that I find astounding about the current situation is what the government's major issues seem to be and what the public's major issues seem to be, and how out of step they are. So
give us a couple of examples.
The public's not out there pounding away saying, oh, we need an immediate pharmacare program or a dental program.
Right.
Those are government priorities. It's not that the public doesn't say, hey, maybe that'd be good. But was that on
in
their
the
top
scheme of things? Yeah.
Yeah. If you're going to give me free dental care, wow, sure, I'll take it.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like dominating the top of the list. The focus of the Canadian population right now is on their cost of living. Now, you could look at those things from a cost of living perspective, but people are really looking at things like groceries, especially the cost of housing.
Yeah.
Anything that's related to the cost of energy. All of those things that are where we've seen a huge escalation in their costs in the minds of the public over the short period of time, which has given them a sense of uncertainty and really depressing their hope about the future. That's where the public is. But I don't really hear that from the government right now, or basically any governments,
right?
Because this has caught them as off guard as it has the public. Because as I said, the last time around, people were coming out. The important issue before was starting to move back up, and we were getting back on climate change. And that's why we're even having a conversation about, great resets and all those kinds of things. So we were, getting into that situation. Omicron came on, Ukrainian war came on. We're coming out the other end in a very different situation in which people are not stepping out of their homes now with a sense of hope, but a sense of grave concern. about a whole set of issues that relate to their ability to make their money last through a month. That's what's on the agenda. Now, the government might be able to say, well, we're going to give you free pharmacare, but that's not going to help me today.
Yeah, it doesn't help you pay the mortgage. I want to ask about this long-awaited, the government has really engaged on the issue of truth and reconciliation and has over the last 6 or 7 years. The papal apology and the promise to come to Canada and do it on Canadian soil, although details have yet to be worked out. Does this matter to the broader population? Do we think this is the right and fair thing to do and it's come too late, or is it to the community itself? How much broader is it?
No, Canadians overall do look back at the relationship of, for want of a better term, the settler society with the Indigenous peoples as being not a positive one.
Right.
And there is enough evidence that's percolated through to the average Canadian now, where their view is that the Indigenous community, what the church is doing is the right and fair thing to do, and they will greet that as a positive development. But will it take the place of the issues that we've been talking about over the last while? No. All of these issues that relate to acknowledging groups of the Canadian population, Indigenous issues, issues about minority populations in the country, are all ranked fairly low in the Canadian list of issues. They pop up when something specific happens in the news, right. But they descend down pretty quickly again. So we don't have. It's not an everyday thing, but I think the consistent pattern in terms of the public believing that that there was wrong done, that there needs to be a process of reconciliation, and that steps like these are the right things to do. Fighting against that has gone away, and steady improvement and steady increase in people's belief that these are the sorts of things that need to be done.
I think there's going to be a big thumbs up on this, because for better or worse, it's kind of like they've gone to the top and he said he's sorry, and that's an important thing.
Right. And then the question comes, what comes after that? And that's always the question, right?
Yeah.
So people are very supportive of Indigenous issues until it means that you can't get a pipeline built.
Yeah.
Or it means that the railway gets blocked.
Yeah.
Or it means that it's going to cost you something. Or you feel that people aren't being treated equitably. Yeah. That's when it starts to get difficult.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you, and then I'll let you go, but I can't ignore it, because everywhere I turn, people are talking about this, the slap.
Yeah.
And all of the issues that it brings up. I mean, the Oscars are about the comedian sitting there making fun of other people. The divide in Hollywood now. And I've got to say, amongst the people that I've talked to about this, the issue is Will Smith looked a bit nutty, and Chris Rock rose above it all and carried on with his life. I mean, this whole kind of defending your woman thing seemed a little out of step in 2022.
So I have my human reaction, and then I have my social scientist reaction.
Okay, give us both.
Okay, so my human reaction was I didn't care why it happened.
Yeah.
As a male Canadian, you can use whatever pronouns you want to describe me, who grew up in a certain era and had his fair share of street yards or schoolyard knockdown and dragouts, right. and hockey did the same thing. I just looked at him as a bully. Yeah. I just looked at it. Okay, this is a guy who you not only sucker punched, you sucker slapped.
Yeah.
And he was much smaller than you, and it would normally be seen as something where, I talked to my wife about this, and my immediate reaction was, well, if it was The Rock instead of Chris Rock, would he have done that?
Exactly.
Would he have done that to Dwayne Johnson? And the answer is not on your life.
Yeah.
And a lot of men go through that kind of situation. You know, some guy flipping you the bird, you know, with road rage or whatever. And the second he gets out of the car and you get out of the car and you realize he's the offensive center for the Ottawa Rough Riders, you might sit back into your car. So I looked at it as a guy who knew that he suffered no potential threat, ambushing somebody and humiliating him by not even punching him. He slapped him. That's
a boy thing. Yeah.
That's what I said. Okay. So so everybody who's going to be critical and send me emails about my whatever, this is who I am. I accept it. You accept it too, please. But the other thing, as I went through that, and this is where the social scientist part of me came in, as I read the various reactions to what is interpretations to it, it brought me back to phenomena in science called the Heisenberg Principle, which is that what has changed is what happens. Anything that happens in the world is changed by the person who observes it. Right. So it was a very classic example for me, a wonderful example that I'll be using in presentations and conversations with people going forward of the classic, where you sit is where you stand. So I heard everything from this was representative of the fact that somebody finally is standing up for a Black woman, unlike people stood up for this Supreme Court Justice, Justice Jackson, she went through the previous week. How the two of them are related, I don't know. But if that's your big issue, that's how you saw it.
You saw it through that lens. Yeah.
Right. Toxic masculinity. I saw, a lot of that. I saw a lot of, racial kinds of conversations. I saw a lot of gender-related conversations. I saw a lot of, Main Street versus Hollywood type conversations. And all of them more reflective of the person who was saying or writing what this was about.
This is the Rorschach test, right? But
you said, Senator, you said it exactly how I feel. It was a Rorschach test related to the person who was making the commentary, which is a really good way of anybody who's in the line of work that I'm in particular, to remind yourself of. Every number that you see, every interpretation that you see is not devoid of your personal life experience. And I have to constantly go back to my colleagues and clients or other people and say to them, if you weren't who you are, would you really see this that way?
Right.
So when you see that number, you're interpreting it based on where you're coming from, as opposed to what people are actually saying to you or what this actually represents.
Sure. Absolutely.
So it's a constant battle for me to be able to say, I shouldn't be reacting to the Will Smith episode as the, 17-year-old Darrell Bricker playing, hockey in Cambridge, Ontario. That's none of those guys are hockey players. That's not their world. I mean, how does that all work out? I don't know. I'd be interested in hearing what they have to say about what this was all about. But everybody else who was talking about it, it was like, now I understand why you see everything that you see in those terms, because you can't think of any other way to think about it. If all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail.
Nope, that's exactly right. And that's the thing about polling too. I mean, that which everybody says, like we all see it through our own eyes. We all see these issues but I do appreciate what you do. And I'm so glad I asked you about that, because that was a really interesting answer. Thanks.
Well, honestly, Senator, I mean, if you've been in enough times where somebody shoves you in the corner on a rink and you turn around and you let them have it, I mean, that men of my generation, that's what it was.
Exactly.
Right? So I looked at it that way, but it's not.
But if you can't take the heat, stay out of the Hollywood kitchen and don't sit in the front row at the Oscars, because that's what they're going to do, is make fun of how lousy your movie was or what you look like.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, it'll be interesting. I think this one will have, because it's such a memeable moment.
Yeah.
It will have a long history. And unfortunately for both Chris Rock and Will Smith, it'll be the thing people remember about both.
Well, Chris Rock's making the best of it. I mean, his first outing this week in public, just going, so what'd you do on the weekend?
So what has every journalist ever said to somebody who wants to get mad and phone the editor, right? Which is, don't take on people who buy the rink by the barrel.
Yep. No.
They got
Exactly.
tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day.
And the next year.
Yeah.
Great talking with you, Darrell. I can't wait for the numbers, the next polling on the.
Oh, stay tuned. There's one out today on the budget. So
okay, that's great. We'll be in touch. Darrell Bricker, CEO of IPSOS Public Affairs, international polling firm, just covering the waterfront today, and why not? Thanks, Darrell. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you.
That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin.